window shifting and other people may have different views on that. We're sure to hear some of that as well. The panel session today will address questions that arise around these different approaches that occur across Australia in terms of prescribed burning and how they're impacted by that suite of issues. What we've got is a really diverse panel that I'm about to introduce, and quite deliberately, because the beauty of prescribed burning is it never has been, I don't think, proposed by anyone reputable at all that a one-size-fits-all. There's different approaches, different reasons for doing things, and generally it doesn't make one right over another. And I think it's incredibly important when we talk about such a diverse subject that we have a diverse panel. We're very, very pleased to have that. So I'll introduce the panel to you today. We've got Fiona Gill from the Department of Environment and Water, South Australia. Dr Neil Burrows, Senior Principal Research Scientist, Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions in WA, and specifically the Parks and Wildlife Service of that organisation. Dr Richard Thornton from the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. Deb Sparks from the Centre of Excellence for Prescribed Burning. Judy Parr from the US Forest Service. And Oral McGuire at the end from Gundi Consulting Proprietary Limited. The way we're going to do this is we've offered each of the speakers 5 minutes to give a presentation, both verbally or via slides, however they want to, basically within the realm of that very broad subject matter I touched on. So sort of no guidance into where we expect them to go. We thought we'll set the scene with their presentations around how they view these challenges. A very short presentation. Once we've been through the 6 presentations, we'll obviously open up to the main game, which is an open question and answer session. Please take notes of anything that sparks your attention, because I don't want to be the one asking the questions. I really like those to come from the floor. So we'll get on with the first speaker who I'll introduce, and we'll start at the end with Oral McGuire, who's a Wajak Balanong Noongar. Oral's the Principal Consultant of Gundi Consulting, as I mentioned. He brings knowledge of land and forest which has been shared through Noongar stories, song lines and beliefs of the flora and fauna, as well as the significant places and sites to the panel. He has 18 years as a professional firefighter, and for the past 10 years has been practising traditional burning on his 2,100-acre property, where he and his family are transforming the land back to its natural state. Their vision is to plant 1 million trees and create a Noongar cultural sanctuary. I've had a number of discussions with Oral around this, and it's a very exciting proposition. Oral's a prominent Noongar community leader, landholder and long-term champion of Aboriginal employment with extensive experience in traditional land and fire management practices. He has extensive knowledge and experience in government, private enterprise and the not-for-profit sector, and a proven track record in bridging the divide between mainstream and Aboriginal communities. And I have noticed a few Victorians in the room, so I will also add to the bio that Oral was a pretty handy footballer in his day as well. So with that, I'll invite Oral up to give a presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Murray. It's good to be here today. I haven't been a part of the conference apart from this session, but it's obviously here as on the traditional lands of Wajak Noongar. So I want to acknowledge my old people, I want to acknowledge my family groups, my clan groups, and acknowledge the Wajak land that we stand on. This place that we stand on is known traditionally and still known by Noongar people as Burulbiria. It's on the shores, obviously, of the Derbil Yerrigan and at the foot of Kings Park, which Noongars have always called Kaugara. Look, I want to speak about the traditional burning, I guess, practice, because it's been something that's been utilised in this country and around the world, I guess, if you go back to the traditional land management practices of old cultures across the world, across the globe. And Noongar were part of a system where fire was a key part of the way the land essentially was kept in balance. So fire was not a risk, it was not a threat. That's not to say that fires didn't get out of hand or turn into wildfires. I think they probably did, certainly through lightning strikes. But essentially the land was shaped by the practices and I guess the mindset that Aboriginal people had about fire in how the resources were managed. So in Noongar we had a term for this, and I think in old languages, particularly Aboriginal languages, when something was given a name, it actually indicates a significant value for whatever that was. So whether it was the animals, the philosophy of the culture, the principles of religion, and in this case, balanced land management, or the use of fire in burning country, was known as Kaungara. Now, Kaungara was premised on cultural principles that were essentially about cultural authority and cultural knowledge of country particularly. Holistic knowledge system of Noongar people were the key elements of how Kaungara was implemented and practiced. Those holistic systems, and there were amongst, I guess, a number of them, there were 4 key holistic systems. One was about identity and being. In Noongar they were known as Buja, Mort and Karajan, which is, Buja is country. It's not just the land, it's the country, it's the natural environment. Mort was the kinship system and the law around kinship connections, and Karajan was the holistic system of law of knowledge, which included all knowledge as a sacred component of culture. The second holistic system was Kart, Kort and Mir, which was head, heart and spirit, and that was about knowing and belonging. The third holistic system was about the law itself and the meaning of life. Kajan, Woronga, Kunda, which was, Kajan is about the soul, Woronga is about our totem systems, and Kunda is about our dreaming and songline stories and system. And the fourth system, holistic system, was about the 6 seasons of Noongar Buja. And that was essentially about sustenance and how the whole culture existed in its natural environment. We had 6 seasons: Birak, Bunuru, Jaran, Makaru, Jilba and Tamarang. 2 of those seasons, I guess, are not, well, I guess 2 of them are perfectly placed to conduct traditional burning. So on our farm I've been practicing the traditional burning in Jaran and Tamarang, which are those inter-seasons between the hot and the dry and the cool, the wet, or the cooler months. So in the calendar months around April, May, and leading into June, and then of course September leading into October, and probably finishing by the end of October. So those periods, and I guess what I'm saying is, because of those systems, global warming doesn't really impact on Noongar traditional fire management, because that system of management was essentially an adaptive management model, in that our seasons changed when the seasonal change itself shifted. So when plants dropped seed or the flowers bloomed, they were indicators, and the natural indicators, of when things would start. And it was through that knowledge of country, through that knowledge of the animals, the natural world, and the holistic system and the holistic thinking, Noongars adapted and adopted different times in terms of specific dates. So for Noongar season, it doesn't start, summer does not start on the 1st of December or any other specific date. It starts when country shifts and changes and speaks to the people who know that country. The amazing thing about traditional burning practices is that they were practiced in a consistent way, like our language and like our cultural law, right across this whole country. So when we consider that today social media connects us all, and technology connects us all very quickly, Aboriginal people were also doing that many thousands of generations and thousands of years ago. So I'm going to finish up with some of the challenges, because in my view, global warming is not a threat or a challenge to traditional burning. On our farm, we have not, or traditional burning is not being practiced on our farm for at least 150 years. So we've come back there, we've transformed the farm by revegetating and rehabilitating the land itself. We've infused it with the cultural and spiritual knowledge that we have, and we've used science to actually replant and revegetate the land. The fire, which we've started 10 years ago now, is now infusing that spirit of all of those species, plants and animals, with the balance of our cultural knowledge. And so the threats to traditional burning are actually about value frameworks, in that cultural knowledge is not really valued yet. I hear a lot of talk, but I don't see, particularly in our country here, Nyungas controlling and owning traditional burning practices and methodologies. Science itself breaks down cultural knowledge and disempowers traditional owners. Governance and the authority to control and manage removes empowerment again from Aboriginal people and traditional owners, and effectively traditional owners do not get engaged appropriately or effectively. And resource allocation and resource management are the threats. So the whole thing is about getting the country back into balance. Land tenure is another threat to traditional burning, and so all the jurisdictions around the laws and practices and what's possible. But effectively, traditional burning was about keeping things in balance, and unfortunately, our land is completely out of balance. And so a lot of work needs to be done by all of us for the best practices and best scenarios of where traditional burning can certainly come back into play. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Oral, and I'm certain that's sparked, pardon the pun, a few questions for a little later on. Secondly, I'm going to invite Fiona Gill up. Fiona's the Director of Fire and Flood, the Department of Environment and Water South Australia. Fiona's worked in South Australia's Department for Environment and Water for the past 20 years, has been in the role of Director Fire and Flood since mid-2017. She leads a statewide fire program for the extensive reserve system managed by that agency, as well as is the flood hazard leader responsible under the state's emergency management plan. Fiona oversees a fire management program which is delivered by about 150 staff across the areas of planning, science and operations. Please join me in welcoming Fiona.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I've been asked to share some thoughts and reflections from a land management agency perspective. So I would like to acknowledge that this is from the perspective of a National Parks Agency, an Environment Agency, and acknowledge all of the other land managers who are in the room today that work in forestry and water authorities, who might have very different perspectives to those of mine. As Murray said, we in our Environment Department manage an estate of about 25% of South Australia, and we do active fire management in 6 of our 8 regions there, and we also lead a burning on private land program. So you can't talk about prescribed burning without talking about changing windows. So what are the impact of weather trends that are happening in South Australia with prescribed burning delivery? This is just a snapshot of one of the regions that we manage, the Mount Lofty Ranges, which is otherwise known as the Adelaide Hills, so the large band of vegetated and populated hills to the east of Adelaide. So what we're seeing there is that in autumn the window might be narrowing slightly, so it's starting later but it's finishing around the same time. That's having implications for our program where we need to do multiple burns on days that are suitable. We might need to plan burns of fewer hectares, and I'll touch further on this, but the potential for the increasing overlap with the grape harvest is a significant issue for us. Autumn is when we tend to deliver most of our larger and more complex burns, so that narrowing window is something that we need to pay attention to, but the spring window appears more stable. So as I mentioned, one of the things that the changing windows are leading to for us as a land manager is managing the smoke impacts and the impacts that that has on society and industry. So obviously there's an increasing awareness of health impacts of prescribed burning, smoke impacts from that. But one of the key issues for us is the economic and social impacts that prescribed burning can have. So we're seeing under a changing climate that the overlap with the onset of ripening for wine grapes is going to become more frequent, and an outcome of that in autumn of last year that led to quite a late harvest, a really strong overlap with our prescribed burning program and the government decision to suspend all of our burns in that Mount Lofty Ranges region and move those on. So that presented quite a challenge for us. So it's really a significant trade-off issue. Just wanted to touch on fire planning, which governments aren't always good at planning for the unknown or the uncertain, so this is a very challenging space for us. We have fire management plans, many of which are relatively old, and they take very little account of climate change, and they only cover about 60% of the park, so we've got some catch up to do. And obviously in that next generation of fire management plans, we're really challenged by what that means to incorporate climate change thinking into those. But a really key area for us to be paying attention to, and I was very heartened by the keynote address this morning by Craig Fugate, for those who saw it, who spoke about the planning and development system and how appropriate land use planning really helps to reduce future risk. So for us to think about where people live and what they live in, what houses we allow people to live in, is really critical to drive the kind of prescribed burning for risk reduction that we need to do at that interface. Obviously we can't do prescribed burning unless the community allows us to do that. So social licence is one of the greatest challenges we have as a land management agency. So the notion of how much does the community understand about our work, and do we have community support for prescribed burns? The other challenge for us is always that tension between suppression and mitigation. So have we got the balance right? Do people understand the important role? And then of course it moves into the space of ecological outcomes and risk mitigation. And there shouldn't be binary choices, but sometimes as a land manager it can appear really challenging to try and balance all of those things. So just in closing, I guess my reflection for our land management agency, that climate change isn't having a significant impact. It is very critical to our thinking, but we're actually being more challenged by those things that I talked about. So managing smoke impacts, managing the community expectations, and then the ability for government to be agile and bold enough to respond to those changes. And then I guess it comes down to those key questions, and coming from a state that has a new government for the first time in 16 years and has a very bold agenda and has just presented a state budget that will give us additional challenges, it is what does society view as important, and therefore what will government fund? So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Next I'd like to invite up Judy Palmer, who's the Deputy Director of Fire, Fuels and Aviation with the US Forest Service. Judy has worked for the Forest Service since 1984. She's currently the Deputy Director, as I mentioned, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She has been involved in fire and fuels management since she started her career and has worked in a variety of positions, including Forest Fuel Specialist, District Fire Management Officer, Fire Prevention, Administrative Services and in Fire Engineering. She's also served on incident management teams her whole career, and her qualifications have included Type 2 Incident Commander, Finance Section Chief, Burn Boss and Division Supervisor, along with many other positions, and stands testament to the diversity of views we have on this, and we look forward to hearing from Judy. Please welcome Judy.
Thank you, Mark. So good afternoon, everybody. As you can tell from my bio, I'm really a practitioner. I've been a practitioner in my career and a manager. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our agencies, our land management agencies first, to give you an idea of what we are in the U.S. So we have two major departments, U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is who I work for in the Forest Service. We manage over 193 million acres of forest and grasslands. And then the U.S. Department of Interior, and under that we have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, along with other agencies that manage. In the U.S., we do a lot of cooperation. We work across agencies. We're very interagency. We work with our state partners, our counties, our rural, our city, our tribal. We also work in fire internationally. So a few things on policy I'm going to just touch on. So We have a guidance for implementation of federal wildland fire management policy. So this helps guide us and ensures we're consistent with implementation of our federal fire policies. And it's across both agencies, but all our agencies, our firefighting agencies, our federal ones. One thing that is in there is we've tried to get some consistency of common terms. So we have two types of ignitions. We have unplanned ignitions and planned ignitions. So we have wildfires and we have prescribed fire. So we also have a national cohesive wildland fire management strategy. It ensures that we all have sort of the same goals across our agencies and with our stakeholders and states. We want fire-adapted communities, we want resilient landscapes, and we want safe and effective response. And I could talk for hours about that, but I won't. So yesterday, I really appreciated the early morning discussions. Fire-adaptive species and communities, we live with the same things. You look at what we've done, we've excluded fire from our ecosystems, and our ecosystems depend on fire in a lot of our vegetation types. So as you can see, we've seen a huge change in what's out there on our landscape. That's why we need to reintroduce fire. If we look at the US right now, so that's a lot of acres, just like you guys have. There's almost 85 million acres that are at very high risk to wildfire and insect and disease. So that's a lot of acres that we need to treat to reduce that risk. I think across every nation, you'll notice that wildfires have increased. The number of acres have increased. The number of fires has increased. Right now, if you've been watching any news from the US, you've probably seen a few fires in California. So we're going to talk about the tools to reduce our hazardous fuels. 85 million acres that are at very high risk. So prescribed fire is one of those tools. This year, in the Forest Service alone, our goal is to reduce fuels on 3.2 million acres. That includes prescribed fire and mechanical, but that's our goal. Within my region, which is Arizona and New Mexico, and we have 11 forests and grasslands, our goal is to treat 220,000 acres. Already we've prescribed burned over 150,000 acres. So when we talk about prescribed fires, there's a lot we have to do before we even implement that. You know, we don't just go out and just like you guys, everybody else does in the nation. You know, we have to have a land resource management plan, fire management plans. We have to have site-specific planning and analysis. We have to have a prescribed fire plan, a complexity analysis. And we have to comply with our National Environmental Policy Act, our Endangered Species Act, our Historical Preservation Acts, along with a lot of other laws and regulations. We also have to have qualified people to do it. So as I thought about this, I made a list of the challenges we face. And it was interesting because it was a really long list, so I didn't put it up on a screen. And I was like, wow. So I talked to practitioners, I talked to our agency administrators. You know, one thing that came to mind is we have wildfires going across the nation. In Oregon, Washington, California, we're in preparedness level 4 right now. We were in preparedness 5. Yet, in Arizona and New Mexico, we are primed to do prescribed fire. Conditions are excellent. So how do you relate that? How do you explain that to our publics, that we have wildfires and firefighters from Australia and New Zealand, and we're going to go out and light fire on the landscape? Resource availability. Do we have the resources we need? That can be a challenge. Do we have the funding? We get a lot of money for fuels reduction, but do we have the funding in that spot to do what's needed to be done on the landscape? Qualifications. Are our folks qualified? Are agency administrators qualified to even do the work that needs to be done? Inability to share resources. So all our policies, we talk about interagency. We all understand each other, we understand the needs, but can we share our resources across the landscape? Do we have budget constraints? We have lack of agreements in place, so I can't go burn across to the National Park Service, potentially. Those are challenges we face. Now, there's a lot of ways we overcome that. Other things, we're risk adverse at times. We have this fear of an escape fire. What's going to be the impacts of that? I'm going to have to be reviewed. I've been that practitioner that had that escape fire. You know, how's the public going to view us when that happens? Escape fires from prescribed fires, less than 0.5%. But what's that bad outcome we don't know about? Burn windows. Are we able to burn during that time? Smoke. You know, what are we going to impact with the smoke? What highways might we close? How are we competing for air sheds? So I came up, I made this really long list, and I really went back to what's that silver bullet? How do I fix this? Or how do we fix this? And it really came back to a lot of our challenges are self-inflicted. It's ourselves. Is there other ways to do things? So that's sort of where I landed with the challenges as a practitioner and a manager is a lot of these are self-inflicted. How can I help resolve them? So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. Next I'd like to introduce Dr. Richard Thorndyke. People may have heard him speak already in these last couple of days. Richard's the CEO of the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, a position he's held since the start of that CRC in 2013. Prior to that, Richard was the Deputy CEO and Research Director of the Bushfire CRC that preceded the current one, and a role he held since 2004. Richard's a highly experienced research management executive with over 20 years in the field, both with the Bushfire CRC and Telstra prior to that. Richard has a physics background and has worked in many science areas. Until 2016, Richard was a member of the board of the International Association of Wildland Fire and the chair of the editorial advisory committee of that group, and he's still a member of the committee. Richard is a current board member for the CRC Association. Please welcome Richard.
Well, I did cut that intro down. That's okay. I'm just going to throw out some challenges. Some of you who were at Murray's Busselton workshop will have seen these slides, but I'm going to put a slightly different tint onto them. So what's research telling us? For a start, research is telling us that it's absolutely a no-brainer that if you reduce the amount of vegetation and fuel in the environment, your fires will be less hot, they'll travel slower, and you will reduce risk. So that's a no-brainer. You know, when we look at these words about changing climate, I think what we're seeing at the moment is a changing climate in terms of the understanding of science and the belief, if you like, in science. Science isn't belief-based, it's fact-based. And I think we've got a way to go to make sure that people start to understand that science is important and can underpin what we do. So let me start with, so what's happening? There's, from a science perspective, well, the answer is there's a lot out there. Neil, I think in his talk yesterday, it's always a challenge to go just before Neil, because Neil can then call the bullshit on what I just said. But we know there's an awful lot of science out there. We know that that there's a number of dubious bits of research out there that has got published in reputable journals. We have to accept that, and we have to know what it's there. So there is a lot happening. If we go back from 10 years ago, we now have much better predictions and forecasts. So some of the underpinning information that we need to do prescribed burning is there. We have better understanding of ecological impacts and benefits. We understand better how to do risk assessments and importantly, how we can mitigate some of those risks. And we have to remember that although prescribed burning is a risk treatment and it should be reducing risk, there's actually a peak in the middle to get from one risk state to the lower risk state, which includes creating more risk in the short term. So the period that you've got the burn running creates a much more risk. We do have a better understanding of smoke impacts. We have a better understanding of where smoke will go. We can do better warnings around that, so we can understand that. But on the converse of that, we also better understand the impact of smoke on public health, on agriculture, and on public amenity. So we need to accept that all that understanding is there. We understand fire behaviour a lot better. We understand community engagement better, and how we need to engage the community in these practices, because that comes down to the social licence question. So, why is this important? This the clicker does not work. Aha, this is fine. It's important. Why should this be important to you? Well, it's important to you because there's all this extra information, and you really need to know what it is. So it comes down to, we have better observations, we have better data, but do you know how to access it? So what is your processes internally to be able to access the data, the observations? It's important for things like firefighter safety. If we're not using the latest models and data and observations, then you're potentially putting your workers at risk. So we need to understand that. It's also important because there is another world other than ours out there. It's full of politics and it's full of inquiries. You're in an unenviable position of being told you must burn more, but you're not allowed to make any mistakes. You're not allowed to let it escape. You're not allowed to smoke out people. You end up with public and commercial outrage about that smoke that you've just sent down the rivers during the Easter holidays, or that you've wrecked a crop of grapevines. So you've got all these competing objectives, and that's got to be done within a framework of reduced funding. So you have to justify your expense against other departments, other things that could be being done. So all of those things are really important. But the really important thing, and it comes down to you understanding what science is, and as I said, there's a lot out there. It is important because when things go pear-shaped, I can guarantee you that the inquiries, the lawyers, and the public will know all of the best practices and all the best science. So the end point I want to leave you with is, what do you know? Are you going to be caught out at the next inquiry for not knowing what the science is on the topics that you're going to be involved in? If you don't want to be in that position, reflect on that for a moment about how, when you go back to your jobs, are you going to ensure that you find time in your busy schedules to actually read some of the science that's out there, and not just think, oh, I'm going to put that into an inbox folder for a while and I'll read it some other time. Because the next time you may be reading it is in a response to an inquiry.
Thank you very much, Richard. And echoing that last view, I can tell you from experience that don't rely on someone else to acquire knowledge for you, because when you need it, you're going to need it. Next, I'd like to call Neil Burrows. Neil's the Senior Principal Research Scientist for the Department of Biodiversity Conservation and Attractions. And Neil's worked as an applied bushfire scientist, fire policy and fire management advisor, and science director with that department and its predecessors for almost 42 years. And I think he mentioned yesterday during the keynote speech of the CRC that he might have 10 days left, so that would be now 9. So not long to go, isn't it? He's been around the business a long time. His diverse research themes include fire behaviour and fire ecology in a range of ecosystems, including eucalypt forest, woodlands and softwood plantations in southwest WA, and also spinifex grasslands in the western desert. Neil has also experience in fire management planning and prescribed burning, and during summer, as many people in this room will know, participates very actively in bushfire suppression as a fire behaviour analyst, and one of the best of them. He's a member of the preformed incident management teams, certainly puts a lot of effort into helping out practitioners. He's a very experienced bushfire investigator, and he assists with incident reviews, inquiries and legal processes, which happen all too often, as Richard touched on. following major or significant bushfires. Please join me in welcoming Neil.
Thanks, Murray. I'm going to, while the whole of Western Australia is obviously affected by climate change, as is the whole of Australia, I'm going to restrict my comments to the southwest. With respect to climate change, there's winners and losers, I guess, if you think how much rain you're going to get defines that. And certainly the southwest of WA is a loser. The earliest climate change models that I read about when I was a student were published in 1975, would you believe, when we used to call it the greenhouse effect. And unfortunately, some of those predictions, as crude as they were then, are coming to pass. But the southwest of WA is experiencing reduced rainfall. Since the mid-1970s, rainfall across much of the southwest has reduced by between 18 and 20%. And most of that has been a reduction in winter rainfall. We in the southwest have what I call a hot Mediterranean type climate, so 70 to 80% of our rainfall falls in winter. So we've got long periods of dry weather through late spring, autumn, summer into early autumn. Traditionally, I guess, or historically, our prescribed burn program in the southwest has been based around spring. So as soon as the fuels, the vegetation starts to dry out, coming out of winter, we start burning, and we stop burning when it gets too dry to burn, and the fires become too difficult to manage because the fuels have dried out too much as we go into summer, towards the end of spring and the summer. It varies from north to south in the southwest. And then we'll start up again in autumn, but after we've had some autumn rainfall to put a bit of moisture back into the fuels and take the sting out of fires. So that's how we've done it historically. What we've noticed, I guess over the last 15 or 20 years, it sort of crept up on us, caught us by surprise a bit, even though we're aware of climate change, etc. I think we were perhaps in denial a little. We noticed that the spring burning window was starting to narrow on us most years. This year will be different because we've had a pretty good wet winter. It was narrowing because our winters were drier, were getting drier. So even when we came out of the winter and into spring, the fuels and the soil dryness index was high. The fuels were already getting pretty dry. So by about early in the spring, mid-spring, they had to stop burning. It was just getting too dry. So we then, more recent times, we're getting some dry spells through winter. So we'll start doing some winter burning. And we've actually done a bit of that. So we haven't locked into any windows yet. We just see what each season brings. We monitor it. And if this year looks like it's going to be something of a more average year, certainly for the southwest, Perth region anyway. Good wet winter rainfalls, we'll probably go into a normal spring drying pattern, and we'll probably have to get some of the usual historical spring burning done. But that's become unusual in the last 10 or 15 years. So I want to talk about what that might mean for wildlife, for plants and animals. I guess if we do more more winter burning, basically it's uncharted waters for us. Most of our research that I've been involved in and others have been involved in the southwest has been around the more traditional fire effects, spring burning effects on plants and animals, summer burning, autumn burning effects on plants and animals. So this notion of what might winter burning do to the ecology and the wildlife of our southwest ecosystems is uncharted. I'm just going to make some general observations, which I'm happy to be challenged on because I don't have any data to support this. These are just deductions based on how I think things might respond. So, as you would appreciate, I don't need to give you a lesson in seasons, but basically plants and animals respond to essentially a couple of stimuli in the environment, including temperature, moisture, and photoperiod, or day length. That's usually what drives reproductive cycles, growth of spurts, and all that sort of stuff in our wildlife. So with with climate change, obviously temperature is going to change, and the moisture content is going to change. But what won't change, of course, is photoperiod. That's going to stay the same. Let's get this thing moved. Yep. So I'll just run through what I think, and these are opinions. As I said, I don't have much data to support this stuff. What I think winter burning might do on plants, and to some extent, it depends on when in winter we're talking about. Are we talking about the early winter, so coming off the back of autumn, or are we talking about late winter going into spring? So I don't know. Let's go somewhere in the middle. But some of my comments are based on the premise that we have had some opening winter rains, so the country has wetted up somewhat. So that puts us probably more towards the spring end of winter rather than the autumn end of winter. And I think with plants, I'll just run through the major taxonomic groups. The plants, or the major taxonomic groups with it. With the plants, I think there's going to be pros and cons. If we do winter burning, sort of backing into towards the end of winter, we can expect that the fire intensities will be lower because there'll be more moisture in the system in winter. So we would expect less physical damage to the vegetation with lower fire intensities, less fuel removal. We would expect less impact on geophytes. Certainly those geophytes, geophytes are plants that spend part of their life cycle below ground, things like orchids, like that. By and large, not all species, there's a few species of orchid that flower during winter, but most of them have a spring flowering period, so they're above ground in spring. So winter burning is likely to have a lower impact on those because they can be sensitive to fire when they're above ground. Fires will be patchy, so I think there'll be greater survivorship. The downsides, we probably will see reduced seedling germination and survival because if the fire triggers seed release and germination, it's got to now then a long dry period to get through the spring and summer and following autumn before it gets to the next wet period. We could see greater impact on flowering and abundance and possible slower recovery rates in a reduced rainfall. So germination, growth, maturation will be slower in a lower rainfall. Oh my God, for time, Murray. We're running out, so I'm going to run through. Okay. I'll just go to the last slide. Basically, there are little data. I think by deduction, localised winter burning is unlikely to have any long-term adverse effects because it will be raining occasionally. It's not as though I suspect any particular patch of bush is going to get winter burnt every 6 or 7 years. It's going to happen infrequently. But I do want to point out there's going to be some losers and some ecosystems are going to be really badly damaged, and these unfortunately will be peat swamps and organic substrates. I think see them while you can, because I think they're probably on the way out. On that cheery note, I'll finish. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. I wouldn't have hurried you up if you were softer at the end as that, but we're almost here. Our final speaker before we have time for a couple of questions is Deb Sparks. Deb's a Senior Project Officer at AFAC and at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, or ADA, as many people know. And is in that role, delivers national projects that include the Centre of Excellence for Prescribed Burning and the National Fire Danger Rating System. I'll introduce, please welcome Deb.
I'm going to toss my presentation out because we're short of time, but I just wanted to show you my first picture because in social media very often I get disheartened when people say it's 20 years since Stand By Me came out or 20 years since Michael Jackson released Thriller. Well, I just wanted to say it's 30 years since Tom Hanks released Big, and it's also 30 years since the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was started. And so I was going to talk about how people are still talking about future climate scenarios, and I think that the future actually is now. It's happening. We're seeing it this year with fires pretty much all over the world happening, early fires in Australia, etc., etc. And I wanted to talk a little bit about whether we're going to keep relying on past data to inform us, and there is a place for that, I understand that, but we can't say, for instance, that we'll never get a major bushfire in southeast Queensland, for instance, because potentially we could. So we need to start looking at a future path on how we adapt to these changes. And I'm not just talking climate change, I'm talking weed invasions like gamba grass in the Northern Territory, all of the science changes as they occur, all the political changes, all the social expectation changes. They're happening all the time. So, excuse me, I believe that the traditional custodians of this land were very adept in evolving with their country, as Ol alluded to in his speech. And I think we can learn not just from them about how they did their cultural burning, and just personally I'd like to see some more traditional owner burning on the land, and agencies are working towards that. But more importantly, I think that the way that they shared their knowledge is an important learning for us, and that was through storytelling and passing on the knowledge through yarns. And in our current work environment, sometimes we just don't have time to read those inbox emails about science. We don't have time to go out on country with those great people like Neil Burrows and pick his brain about everything he knows about burning in Spinifex country, for instance. So I see, I'm just going to do a little spruik for the Centre of Excellence here, I see that we play a role in that, in facilitating those conversations, getting practitioners talking to each other, getting them talking to researchers, getting researchers talking to practitioners, and remaining flexible through those conversations to any change that is or may occur. Thank you.
Okay, we've got hopefully 10 or 15 minutes of questions, so what I'd like to do now is thank all the speakers. I'll thank them all formally at the end, but in the meantime, get straight to some audience questions if we've got some. So if you can, I know I've heard speakers say it's very hard to see, so you will have to jump up and down and wave your arms when you're picking because it's very bright. Yep, down the middle. If you introduce yourself briefly and target a particular panel member or more generally, up to you.
Thank you. Will Carmody from Cascade Bushfire Brigade in the southwest, or in the southeast of Western Australia. My question is to Dr. Neil Burrows in regards to rainfall, the experience and loss in rainfall. Across Dr. Pauline Grierson's work from UWA in regards to her rainfall change in cycles over the last thousand years, and does that fit in with any work which has, I suppose, happened with prescribed burning in the various cycles?
Is that on? Yep. Yeah, thanks for the question. I wouldn't say I'm across it, I'm aware of Pauline's work and the work some of her students have been doing, dendrochronology and other studies to try and reconstruct rainfall records. It's a while since I read one of the papers, but I think what we're facing with climate change at the moment is the speed with which it's changing. The rainfall, historically, it's been up and down, but it's been on much longer wavelengths, if you like, and now we're seeing it change so rapidly. It's changing in our lifetime, in my lifetime. It's changed since, in Western Australia, it's changed since the 1970s. It started to trend downwards. So I'm not sure that we can learn much from those historical records, because I don't know how those historical changes in rainfall as reflected through tree growth from the dendrological studies that Pauline's group did, how that reflected on fire regimes, and we just don't have that information to match those up, so probably not very helpful, but it's the best I can do.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Will. Do we have one right at the back? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anna Negreiros. I'm Environmental Officer for the Department of Fire and Emergency Service. I have a question for Judy Palmer. Judy, I have actually two questions. In your presentation, you said that most of the workers within at federal level and perhaps state level as well, they are firefighters. I just want to, and you as a manager, as a practitioner as well, you're talking about like pretty much everyone. Is that something that is an obligation when you become a part of your agency, which we don't have in here? And my other question, it is, if you have all this bureaucracy to do prescribed burn, and you're accountable if you have a hop over, how you justify, not you, but how can you justify what is happening in California? How is the government accountable? Like in here in Australia, we always have an inquiry, as it was mentioned before, and someone or an agency will point the finger out? And how is in US, in America, how do you deal with that? Is this an issue? Is the community resilient? And could you please give an example? Thank you.
I think I said 2 questions, there's about 15 questions in there, so have a go at a couple.
Let me attempt this. First off, so no, it's not an expectation that everybody in our agency is firefighters. We hire people specifically as firefighters. We hire them as fuels managers. We also have people who come in as wildlife biologists, NEPA coordinators. So it's not the expectation that everybody in our agency is a firefighter. We do have a lot of people, though, that contribute to our prescribed fire burning, not just by being a firefighter, but by being that, that specialist, that agency administrator, that line officer, you know, even the information receptionist up front who can talk to it and explain things to our public. The second question, I had a little trouble. It was about escape, if we have an escape prescribed fire.
There's a question around accountability in California and inquiries, I guess, as well. Yeah.
Okay, so, you know, essentially the way I'll talk prescribed fire first. The way that works is a line officer, an agency administrator, along with that practitioner is signing off on that plan. And every day we do a go, no-go decision, and that's signed off on. So that responsibility, that finger pointing, and that liability goes to that agency administrator along with that burn boss, the person who's out there initiating all the actions. So if we have an escape, that's usually where our liability comes back to. Now, and what we do is if we have an escape, it depends on what the effects were. You know, we may have an escape, but we bring it back in prescription within one operational period, or we may have an escape that goes and burns 10,000 acres of grasslands, which I've seen in the last 5 years. So that accountability comes back to that, but we also have, if you're practicing within your scope, our agency will represent you, and you won't usually be held personally liable. Our agency will cover you for that, as long as you're within the scope and not doing something outside of our practice. Realizing that fire is very dynamic, we can't always say what it's going to do and what's going to happen when we have that. On the wildland fire side, again, that goes to the agency administrator who's got that responsibility. You know, I'm not sure if you meant that in, you know, how do we explain how we have a wildfire? We have all our resources, we have international resources there helping us fight it, but yet we are gonna, in our nation, somewhere else, have a prescribed fire. And we have to do risk assessments, analysis, and determine if we have the resources we need, and if we can successfully implement that burn without impacting the wildfire that's going on at the same time.
Thanks, Judy. I think there was one just in the middle here.
Yeah, hi. Dave Lanky. I come from Central Council on the Central Coast of New South Wales. I guess mostly towards Deb. As a council person who's also a firefighter, I guess the history in New South Wales is 20 odd years ago. The RFX was corporatised and put into responsibilities were taken off camp. That means for the last 20 years or so, councils have been much less involved in anything around prescribed burning. It's starting to improve, but our council's got about 8,000 hectares of bushland, managed for various reasons, mostly conservation. We just really don't have that culture in the last 2 decades of prescribed burning on our land, and consequently not a whole lot's been done. And I suspect we're not the only council that's like that. And we would like to improve, and I'm sorry, I'll get to the question. The question is, I'm hoping you've got some sort of strategy to maybe work a bit more with government.
So the Centre of Excellence is happy to work with any agency to help them implement the national guidelines and frameworks that we would develop through the National Burning Project. But in the individual jurisdictions, I think for the local councils, it's working with in this case, the RFS, and in WA, it's DFS, and we had this question this morning, Neil, on the radio, and it's about developing those relationships through those state management fire committees to build that capacity. So as a Centre of Excellence, we're not actually delivering any on-ground training, but there's certainly ways that we can help facilitate those councils to know where that training is happening, and we'd be happy to do that as well.
Okay, I think there's one over here. It's got one more because we need to stay on time, so unfortunately, apologies to those who are waiting to ask a question. Was there one last question up in down here? Something? Yeah.
I'm just Kelsey from the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC, and I guess I'll open this one to Fiona, Neil, or Judy, or maybe even Deb. I would be interested to know what departments are doing or planning to do about the greater demand in hazard reduction burning with the restrictions with smoke and health impacts, and how this will be in the future, especially with the changing climate and fire frequency with more severe storms creating more fuel loads, but budget restrictions as a brief example.
Try our best, I guess, would be the short answer. Yeah, look, what you've described there, I think, is the day-to-day reality for government agencies. I can only speak from that perspective who do land management, that it's a balancing act and it's trade-offs. And I think, as I touched on in my talk, that climate change is so significant to what we do, but the day-to-day or week-to-week reality of what we're trying to grapple with in terms of pushback from the community about health impacts, concerns from the wine industry sector around perceived or actual smoke taint, and the fear, I guess, when you undertake a prescribed burn and things go wrong. It is a risky activity, but it's trying to do something to make the outcome of bushfires less impactful. So, yeah, I guess I don't have a simple answer. It's really just a daily trade-off in a way, and for me it's about engagement and listening, and so being really responsive and receptive to what community and stakeholders and industry and your ministers are saying about what we should be delivering, and working as much as possible in a tenure-blind way and as much as possible in a really collaborative way. So luckily in South Australia we're a really small jurisdiction compared with others, so the way that the three main land management agencies, water, forestry and environment, work together with the CFS, I think, is really collaborative, and I know for other states and territories that's a little more challenging because they're big. But yeah, I guess there is no simple answer apart from listening and learning and trying to balance things.
Thanks, Fiona. You have a final quick comment on that one, Richard? Or
I was just going to say, I mean, the important thing to recognise is that all of those concerns are legitimate. But the problem is you don't have a one homogenous community. It's not the whole community that's against prescribed burning. It may be one or two, and they're usually pretty vocal that make it against it. It's how do you balance up the needs of the many against the wishes of the few, and that will always be a political discussion. It goes beyond bureaucracies to deal with that, and it needs to come down to the politicians doing that.
I think I'll leave it there if I can, so we need to keep on track because there's other commitments and functions that award ceremonies that people need to get to. So in wrapping up, thank you Fiona, Neil, Richard, Deb, Judy and Oral. As was announced at the welcome and award ceremony, instead of the traditional speaker thank you gifts, a donation has been made on behalf of the conference to the Fiona Wood Foundation. The steering and program committees of AFAC18 are most grateful for the contribution of all our speakers throughout the conference, particularly the guys sitting up with me. So can we just show our appreciation once more?